Here I am at the UBC farm with Mark Bomford, the farm manager, and just a couple meters behind me is a soil pit, and we are just a couple kilometers from the alder site and the second growth site. Mark, I'm aware that this land, this farm, is used for lots of different purposes. Can you tell me some of the functions that the UBC farm serves?
Sure. The UBC farm is really about diversity, both landscape diversity and diversity in its function. The landscape around us, you can see, is everything from 80-year-old forests all the way to intensively cultivated field plots and really everything in between. The functions of the farm range all the way from the teaching and learning to the research to the community service. And in most cases, a given field or area is going to be serving many of these functions at once. So some examples might be, a teaching project could be our new apprentice course, where university students, as well as university-age students from the community, are learning about the fundamentals of horticulture, organic agriculture, and small farm production in a season-long course where they're learning hands-on, in-depth throughout the duration of the year. An example of a research project might be just down that way, where we're doing some trials on a new kind of fertilizer, a biologically active one, and we've got all of the field research plots laid out in replicates and with all the different treatments. And an example of a community service project might be something like the Urban Aboriginal Community Kitchen Garden Project. Participants there, typically from the downtown east side and from First Nations communities, are coming to the farm to grow, harvest, cook, prepare food. And intertwined into that is a whole bunch of work on community health. All of the ties between food and where it comes from, and how that links into the bigger picture of individual and community health, linked with the cultural as well. In most cases, all of these functions are intertwined. Every field is doing all sorts of different stuff for the students, for the researchers, and the community.
What are some of the farm management practices going on here at UBC Farm?
The majority of the fields at the farm are managed in intensive vegetable production. We also have some perennial fields with small fruits and berries, and we also have a livestock component, so we rotate livestock through the system as well. This means that all of the fields are planned in a rotation, so we're not doing the same thing on any given field several years in a row, particularly with the annual crops as well as with the small livestock. The vegetable production fields here are intensively cultivated. That means we have primary tillage and secondary tillage on an annual basis, and in many cases where we're getting several crops per year, we actually have tillage happening several times per year as well. The entire farm is managed to meet or exceed the COABC standards for organic production, and that actually means that we use even more tillage for our weed control. We don't use synthetic herbicides for weeds, and one of the most common things we use for weed control is, again, mechanical. Disturbance of the soil, whether it's tillage by hand, by hoe, or by cultivator on a powered tractor implement.
What are some of the things that you add to the soil here?
Well, because we have very coarse textured sandy soils here, we do have to be fairly careful about our nutrient management, because any of those mobile nutrients are easily flushed away by the rain in the winter. So the first strategy before we add anything is to try to not to lose anything. And particularly during the winter, that means not leaving any areas uncovered. So we try to have no bare soil in the winter. We use extensive overwinter cover cropping, both to mop up those nutrients that may be left at the end of the season, and then also legumes to fix nitrogen in the spring as that growth starts up. So already we're getting a lot of our nutrients from the use of those green manures that we plant and grow over the winter and incorporate back in the soil in the spring. The green manures alone typically aren't enough for some of the heavy feeding vegetable crops that we grow here. So we need to have an additional nutrient management strategy where we bring in extra nutrients from off-site. The first thing that we do is we get livestock wastes, bedding and manures from the sheep across the road. We turn those wastes into compost here on the site over a long process and then we apply the compost to the soil in the spring. We also sometimes bring in mineral additions, things like sulfomag or langbonite, that adds some additional mineral nutrients to the soil. And then we also look at the other soil characteristics in terms of its acidity, its pH, and we may amend to correct that as well and ensure it's in the optimum range for the plants to actually access those nutrients that we've applied. So it's really a large strategy. We have lots of different approaches that we use for making sure that the plants get the right nutrients at the right time and that we're conserving what we have.
Can you describe the composting process that you have here?
Well, we make a lot of compost on site. We have a bunch of bins over on the far side of the farm, and we turn the raw materials, which are livestock wastes like bedding and sheep manure, and those are turned by the tractor, which is actually behind us right now, and they get aerated through that process, and eventually over a lot of time they're turned into compost, which we can add to the soil, and then we spread it out on all the fields using a solid compost spreader. The compost has about a 200 cubic meter capacity. What we start with is very, very high in carbon, a lot of sawdust, and not so much of the sheep manure. That's just the material that we get. It does take a long time and many different turns to get it to the point where it is ready to apply in the fields. It takes fairly careful management as well as some fairly careful monitoring of the temperatures that it's reaching every time it's turned into a new pile. One of the things we really have to be careful of is the carbon to nitrogen ratio in our compost. To begin with, our parent materials, our feedstock, that has a carbon to nitrogen ratio of almost 100. We want to get that carbon to nitrogen ratio down somewhere below 30. When we're applying our compost, if we apply it with a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, very little of the nitrogen which is actually in that compost is available to the plants. If we're applying it to the fields with a C to N ratio of maybe 25, we'd consider it basically a nitrogen neutral compost. That is, even though there's about 1.5% nitrogen in the finished compost, very little of it would be available for the plants. If we can get our compost lower in terms of its C to N ratio, somewhere around 15 to 20, then we'd be able to have it as a good source of nitrogen. The only way we could do that at this point would be to have more nitrogen in the feedstock. Maybe something like poultry manure, although we are concerned about the diseases that could transmit to our poultry flocks here on the site. So we're still searching for a better nitrogen source that might make our finished compost a bit more of a source of nitrogen. In the meantime, we use our compost more as a soil conditioner, as a source of nutrients and a source of organic material, but our nitrogen we have to get from somewhere else. Typically, our nitrogen will come from composted fish or composted kelp solutions, which we'll have in suspensions, and they'll go through the drip irrigation system.
I see a overhead irrigation piece here. Can you elaborate on some of the irrigation practices here at the farm?
Yeah, we have to be really careful with our irrigation. That's because in these coarse textured sandy soils, when water ends up in the soil, it doesn't stay there for long. It drains very, very quickly. During these summer months, when there's not a lot of rainfall during this beautiful kind of growing season, lots of sun, lots of heat, we have to irrigate constantly, sometimes 3 times per week, in order to keep the soil moisture level to the point where the plants continue to grow really well. We do work on reducing the moisture loss that actually comes from the top, what evaporates, and we do that through a lot of mulching. You don't see it in this field, but about half the fields on the farm are using some kind of plastic or paper or living mulch to reduce the amount of water which is actually lost to the atmosphere. However, there's not so much we can do about the water which is actually lost downwards because the soil doesn't hold on to much of that. And so we do need to ensure that every field has got a good water source. One of the other things to consider about these very coarse textured soils, if you look at the parent materials, it's also no surprise that these are very stony soils. And this kind of thing is surfacing year after year, no matter how many times we pick the rocks out of this. And this has some very practical management implications. When you're trying to produce in an efficient and productive way and use your machinery well, you don't want a lot of these around. It just really wears down the equipment very quickly. This gets in a tillage implement, and that tillage implement has a third of the lifespan as it might if you were working in some soil that didn't have as many rocks in it. So we continue to pull these things out, but it actually is quite a challenge every year in order to do the work efficiently, keep all of these crops consistent, because to actually mechanize things and to do things on kind of a larger scale, it's very difficult when you have this many stones in the way of the equipment. So this is a very practical, real concern about the physical properties of the soil that has an impact right down in terms of how long your equipment lasts.